Welcome to The Fairer Sense.
With me, Tanja.
And me, Kara.
Women, money, and the fight to break even.
Because we give a shit. And you should too. Today we're talking invisible disabilities and our money.
Hey, Kara.
Hey, Tanja.
We are here today to talk about a topic that I'll just confess I really wanted to talk about because this one's super personal for me.
It is not as personal for me, but I am super jazzed that we're doing this, actually. I feel really strongly about today's episode, too.
That topic is invisible disability. We originally, I think it's fair to just share this, we originally were going to do an episode about disability more broadly, and that's certainly a topic that we could very well tackle in the future. But as we started talking about it more and planning for it more, it became really apparent that we specifically wanted to focus on invisible disability, which is any sort of disability or chronic health condition that impedes a person's ability to work or socialize or kind of go about a quote unquote normal life, but which may not be recognizable or visible to other people.
Yeah, there is an organization actually called the Invisible Disabilities Association, and they have a textbook definition of invisible disability that I'm going to read to you now. To define invisible disability in simple terms is a physical, mental, or neurological condition that limits a person's movements, senses, or activities that is invisible to the onlooker. Unfortunately, the very fact that these symptoms are invisible can lead to misunderstandings, false perceptions, and judgments.
The reason that I, in particular, wanted to talk about invisible disability is because this is actually something that I'm dealing with right now in my life. And I've always known that disability might be on the horizon for me. One of the things that I think is still challenging in talking about invisible disability and specifically how it affects women and our money is kind of the distinction between invisible disability and chronic illness. I think that's actually a pretty tough line to define. And this is not an official definition. You just read the official definition. To me, it comes down to a question of ultimately, do you need accommodation to be able to work? And a lot of chronic illnesses, people might be able to completely manage without needing anything different, without missing any work. And that's great. I think there are some folks who are lucky to be in that category, and then there are lots of others where their chronic health conditions do require some accommodation. Maybe they need to take more time off to deal with it, to have sick time or to go to doctors. Maybe they need to be able to take more breaks, or they need to be able to sit or stand or do things differently, or to have different bathroom access, whatever it is. The blurry line between those two things and the fact that a lot of people have chronic health conditions makes it hard to define something that's already pretty amorphous.
I do not have any sort of disability or a chronic illness. As an outsider, to me, if you see someone who is walking with a limp or wears glasses, you can say, I see that person has a disability, versus some chronic illnesses that might, they might flare up. I don't know. It's a weird thing is the moral of the story. I don't know where I'm going with this. I got a little panicked. It is weird. And I think that people on the outside, people who do not live with either a chronic illness or an invisible disability, don't even think about either one, which I think is a problem in its own right and something that is part of the larger conversation that we'll be having here today and also that's happening in the world.
I think to where you kind of were of it's confusing and it's complicated, that's really why I wanted to talk about this today, because my personal health story is one in which I have an invisible disability. I have a condition called Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome, which I am not going to say again. I'm just going to call it EDS moving forward. But it's a genetic collagen. I call it a collagen deficiency, but it's really basically a collagen structural abnormality. And a way to think about it is that my entire body is built with faulty materials. The most visible thing is that my joints are super flexible. So it turns out that when I was a yoga teacher for all those years, I was actually a fraud. I could do all the pretzel poses because my body is built wrong, but it also manifests in lots of other bodily systems. Like my arteries and veins are too stretchy, which means that when I stand up, my heart rate goes up 50 to 60 points, which is not normal. It's really bad for your heart, but it's because the blood vessels in my legs don't do the work they're supposed to do of squeezing and getting the blood back up to my brain. And that's called postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, or POTS, which is also considered an invisible disability, but in my case is secondary to the EDS. So the hard thing about it, and the thing that I struggle with the most in trying to explain it to people, is that one day I might be totally fine. I might be able to go on a 20-mile hike and feel good through the whole thing. And the next day I might be a mess. Everything might hurt. Or not the next day. It could be a day after I didn't do a thing and everything hurts, or I can only walk a few steps, or sometimes if my feet are affected, I can't walk at all. And it might even be hour to hour. So sometimes I wake up in the morning, I feel great. And then, 30 minutes later, a rib dislocates and I have to lay down for 3 hours. Or I just feel really tired because chronic fatigue is part of it too. And I think it's very hard to explain to people a health condition in which you might look totally fine one day, be completely incapacitated the next, and in any moment be somewhere in between. People sort of expect you, okay, like if I'm going to accept that you have this problem, they want it to be consistent, that you're going to be a mess the same way all the time, or that if you're limited in some way, you will always have that limitation. And when you have something like I do that sort of comes and goes, or that moment to moment affects me differently, it's really hard to communicate that with people.
I think our human brain wants to know, okay, is it on or is it off? And that's it. I think it's sort of the same way people have a really hard time understanding bisexuality, where they're like, no, you're either gay or straight. And I can't figure out this in between place. And I'm like, get your head out of your ass. It's not that hard. But we want to have defined terms. We want to have something that fits nicely into a box. And when something doesn't, brains melt, which is really unfortunate when it comes down to people's health, or when it comes down to people's sexuality, because this impacts how we build our worlds, and thus it impacts people's with disabilities' lives.
It's all so true. And I will say, I do not consider myself the voice of invisible disability. I have one particular set of challenges, and they are starting to affect me in bigger ways more often than in the past. Throughout my 20s, they affected me relatively little. I was hurt more than average, but other than that, it hasn't been something that I've been dealing with forever. So just with that as a premise, I will say, to your point about people like to put things in a box, or they like to see things one way or another, one of the things that I've really been coming to appreciate in the last just year or so is what I've come to think of as the performative aspect of invisible disability, which is in situations in which you might be using some form of accommodation, there becomes this pressure, and maybe this is something I will get over at some point, but I am not over it yet, of feeling like, okay, if I'm using this accommodation, then I had better look disabled because that is what people expect. So I'll just tell you a little story. This year, Mark and I went to Coachella. We go to Coachella every year, but this year we went and I realized that I was going to need accommodation. I told you about the POTS earlier, that like my blood vessels don't get the blood up to my brain. What that means is I really just can't stand for a long time. And at music festivals like Coachella, there's essentially nowhere to sit other than the ground. And getting up from the ground to standing makes it much worse. Plus, you often can't see if you're sitting on the ground. So I decided that this year I was going to get the ADA wristband so that I could sit in the chairs on the riser. Wouldn't be taking a spot that a person in a wheelchair would be using. And I also knew just for myself that if the riser was full, I would, certainly like give my seat to somebody who needed it more than I did. But I thought, if those seats are sitting empty, like I just want to be able to use them. So I got the ADA wristband. I decided that I was going to use a cane chair, like this stool that kind of has a cane handle, and then it looks like a 3-legged cane kind of, and then you can fold it down, it becomes a chair. I was like, well, if I have the wristband and they're going to let me bring in a chair, then I'm going to do that, so that if I can't sit on the riser, I have this cane and I have this chair. But it was crazy because then once I had that wristband and I was using the special security line and I was using the special ticket line and I had this prop that I felt like I needed, then I felt like I had to look like I needed the cane, which I do not. And actually walking and leaning on the cane is really bad for my floppy joints. It made my wrist and elbow and shoulder hurt. But I felt like I had to do that to sort of pass. Otherwise, I thought they'd say, oh, you're faking, or you're just trying to take advantage of the system, or whatever it is. And like, I just feel all kinds of icky about that. I feel like gross that I felt like I had to perform. I feel gross that I did perform. I feel gross that other people's expectations made me feel that way, that I had to. And in a perfect world, I'd just be able to like have this thing, not need it, maybe occasionally get up and dance and not feel like other people were going to be like, what the fuck, which is what I did feel. I felt like, okay, well, I can't really dance if I have this thing. And I've heard similar things from other people with my condition that sometimes they have to use a wheelchair, but then sometimes they feel fine and they can get out of the wheelchair and walk, or they can get up and dance, and that they get so much shit from strangers when they do that. That's the aspect of this that I think is really worth discussing, is the judgment that society puts on people who have invisible disabilities, and especially how that affects us at work and our money, because that's what this show is all about. Woo, that was long. Sorry.
No, it was so good though, because I'm just sitting here thinking about all of the planning and I'm sure levels of stress that went into getting the cane chair TM, getting down to Coachella, feeling anxious about, oh, people are going to perceive me as healthy, but I'm not. Oh, but what if someone is more disabled than I am? And, kind of getting judgment from both sides. It's just like a total, I'm trying to swear less. I really want to say head F word, but I'm trying to think of a family friendly term. I'm honestly drawing a blank, like a mind boggle. There we go. And, this is Coachella. You're supposed to be having a fun time and seeing Beyonce and have your soul ascend to heaven. And you're stressed out about other things. So yeah. And I think, for me, again, as a non-disabled person in every sense of the word, I feel frustrated that we have this world that is so like, prove to me, you have to be sick enough. And we really do make that mandatory in the workforce, especially when it comes to collecting something like disability or any kind of really benefits from the government. We have very strict rules about who can collect and who can't, and who's sick enough and who's not, and who's poor enough and who's not. And it drives me up a wall, because fundamentally social safety nets and, quite frankly, like personal behavior should be about ideally making sure everyone has enough, everyone is safe, everyone is protected. And personally, be kind. Take a second and think, maybe this person has an invisible disability. But of course, no one does. No one does. And I think that's because societally, invisible disabilities are very invisible. I know that sounds a little silly, but we don't see them often represented in our media. People don't talk about them that much. They are literally invisible to our eye, so they become invisible to our brain. We don't think, oh, that person might have Crohn's and like needs to use the bathroom, even though there's no public access to bathrooms,
And let's be real, this is a gendered issue. Not that invisible disabilities don't impact men, because they for sure do. But if you look at the types of conditions that are invisible disabilities, a lot of them are autoimmune, a lot of them are inflammatory, a lot of them are genetic, and they are things that tend to affect women more than men. For example, my condition EDS is genetic, which means that men and women have it equally, but it tends to be expressed more in women. Like a lot of men can be more like silent carriers or only have a few symptoms. And a lot of the autoimmune diseases like fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue syndrome are rarely seen in men. Those are much, much more commonly seen in women. And so I think a lot of this is connected to stuff that everybody knows now, that women's pain is discounted. Women are much more likely to be told by a doctor, this is all in your head. And so the discounting of women's health conditions is absolutely tied up in this, because we as a society can't even accept women's bodies and the needs of our bodies and the differences of our bodies. And so, of course, then when we go out in society with these bodies with invisible disabilities, those invisible disabilities aren't going to be acknowledged. And I just want to add one quick thing, because you brought up Beyonce at Coachella, a negative shout out to Golden Voice for having way too small of platforms. There were so many people in wheelchairs who couldn't get on the platform for Beyonce. I didn't even try, but the security guards just let the partners of people sit on the riser and turned away people in wheelchairs who could not see over the crowd and couldn't see the screens then. So Golden Voice, you have to do better. You have to kick those partners off the stage, which the agreement when you get the wristband says that you will, or have more riser space. But oh my gosh, that like destroyed me to see all these people not able to see Beyonce.
Wow. Oh man, that bums me out hard. Golden Voice. I spoke to Dr. Jennifer Thorpe, an Australian who is living in England. She is a PhD. She works as a researcher and science history journalist. Particularly, she focuses on issues affecting women. And she has written a series for Bustle on invisible disabilities. So we spoke about her research and her personal experience with invisible disabilities.
My editors and I were listening to a cultural conversation about invisible disability that had gradually gotten louder, and people were curious about what these words meant, how they should use them, and what counted as an invisible disability. But also, reading up on invisible disabilities, I was very surprised to realize that I count, because I have major depression. I have major depressive disorder. And we don't often talk about mental health as a disability per se, or as in the same category as other disabling conditions. The research kind of drew me in because it involved conceiving of myself in a different way as well.
I've experienced situational depression, and I live with anxiety. It's so easy to look at me. I'm a very outgoing, bubbly person, and no one thinks necessarily that you're going to have anxiety. And I think mental illnesses are something that we totally look past. We completely, I don't want to say ignore, but they are totally invisible. And that is something that, especially here in the United States, we have a really hard time talking about. So all the more reason that articles like yours and work like yours is important. Along that line, you know, you're Australian, you're based in the UK, you're writing for some US publications. Do you think there's a difference in how our countries, or your two countries and my one country, how we approach invisible disabilities?
Obviously, because I write for a US audience, almost all the feedback I have and all the conversations I have are with people who are based in the US. Increasingly, it seems to be almost a generational thing. In the US, people are becoming a bit more willing to talk about it, and a bit more willing to share their stories about being judged for accessibility issues, using disabled parking spots or toilets or things like that. People are willing to talk about it. In the UK, I think there's still a slight kind of emotional repression is the wrong word, but, you know, wanting to be polite about it and wanting to not cause a fuss. But more than anything, the similarities strike me more than the differences. Women in particular, in all three countries, are dealing with the exact same things, the exact same struggles, the exact same judgment, the exact same difficulties in getting treatment because no one believes them. All of those similar issues are they draw people together. And there are often, you know, within cultural groups, there are differences about whether people think depression is real, for instance, or whether it can be solved by a brisk walk around the block. So that I think is one of the big ways in which we differ from each other.
Particularly around mental illnesses where people are like, well, have you tried just not being depressed? Have you tried thinking happy thoughts, or like you said, getting exercise or giving up gluten, you know, changing your diet or something? It really drives me nuts.
Like, I have tried that, and my friend, you know, told me that one of the biggest struggles that she has, because she has what is classified as quite an intense, severe invisible disability, is people truly thinking that they're being helpful. You know, they really think that suggesting taking, you know, 3 doses of buffalo semen every day and swimming in soy milk is going to help you because they read it on the internet or a friend of a friend said it. But she describes it as she has a PhD like me, and she says that it's like a man describing her thesis to her. It's the same sort of, no, I'm an expert on this because this is my life and my stuff. And if I haven't done that particular thing, if I have chosen not to bathe in soy milk, there's a reason for it. And you attempting to give me your advice and your suggestion suggests that I don't know what I'm talking about. And so that's one of the big things that's come up a lot actually in researching this topic, is how to be helpful without being a dick.
I feel like that's like sick-splaining, you know, where let me explain your own sickness to you. What advice do you have to non-disabled people in speaking about it and supporting disabled people?
I mean, the number one thing is believe people when they tell you that there is something wrong, and don't immediately do something like, oh, but you look so healthy, you look so good, I saw you the other day, you were skipping rope, you know. That belief is very, very important for people who have invisible disabilities, because we don't immediately have obvious signals to others that we are struggling. Contrary to popular belief, Depression is not sitting in a train station weeping all the time. And also, invisible disabilities fluctuate, quite a lot of them. Chronic pain, for instance, and arthritis. You can be having a really good day one day, and then 2 days later, everything is terrible, and you're encountering a lot of difficulty. And that doesn't mean you're getting better. It means that you're having a better day. But also, I mean, the main thing Dr. Quigg told me was she really doesn't like it when people judge the way that she operates in the world as an invisibly disabled person. Whether they look at her and go, well, clearly you're healthy. Why are you using a disabled store? Why are you using a disabled parking spot? Why are you using the lift instead of the stairs? Because, she looks reasonably healthy. Taking an attitude where you don't know what other people are going through is much more helpful than immediately assuming that everyone is not disabled if they don't look disabled. Actually, the thing in the UK that's raised a lot of conversation recently is that the Tube in London, has introduced invisible disability buttons, little badges that you can put on saying, I may not look it, but I may need to sit down. I may need for you to give me space. It's also released these very good ads of, people who are maybe 20 weeks pregnant or, have chronic arthritis or faint a lot, so that they have a signal to other people on the tube, which can get very crowded. It's a lot more polite than public transport in the US. So there is a visible signal that you are a person in need who, despite appearances, really might require extra assistance or extra space. And that, I feel, has been very interesting, listening to people talk about that and how it kind of brings them up short and going, oh, but you don't look like you need to sit down. Well, I do. So that's been very interesting, having the cultural conversation about that.
Yeah, the more we can make the general public aware in small, regular ways that there are people out here living with invisible disabilities, the less weird, I'm using air quotes, it'll seem when someone comes up to you and says, I need to use your bathroom now because I have IBS or something.
Or even, I need to use your bathroom now. I don't necessarily need to disclose why, but I need you to believe me that this is the thing that I need to do now. Because it's always the choice of the person who has a disability to disclose how much information they want other people to know. It's not like having a service dog and being blind. It's not like there are immediate signals about what kind of thing you have. The thing about invisibility is that you do also have control about how much other people know about it, at least some of the time, if you have slightly less severe symptoms. And it's an added thing that they have to think about when it comes to their symptoms and how they deal with the day, because telling people that you have an invisible disability can be distressing, it can be embarrassing, it can be all of these different things. And that doesn't necessarily make the situation better. It doesn't make you feel healthier or anything like that. It can be great, or it can go badly. So this is an additional, the revelation thing is not always uncomplicated. I've chosen to be very open about the fact that I have major depressive disorder, in part because Bustle very much encourages people to reveal bits of themselves that can be really helpful and is a massively supportive environment for that. So one of the really good things about working there is that if you contact your editor and say, I am having a really bad day, they go, okay, how can we support you? Which in freelance writing is quite rare. So I've made the choice to tell people about this, be quite public about it. But I also don't judge anyone who just doesn't want to tell people. I think that is a completely legitimate choice.
Do you have any specific work policies that you would love to see implemented for people with invisible disabilities?
We talked to a couple of disability specialists a little while ago about how to make workplaces more invisible disability friendly. Basically, accessibility needs to be an option for everyone. People in the workspace shouldn't necessarily monitor what they think should be accessible to whom. So I think it's one of those things where, we were talking about having to wear a badge or having to wear some sort of signal that you need to use a disabled toilet. Policing that can get kind of aggressive, I think, in some places. So the specialists that we talked to were very much like, have a set policy and then have certain people that you can choose to disclose your illness to, and then no one else needs to be involved. You don't need to share it with the whole office if you don't want to, but one specific manager or XYZ can know that this is what you have and this is what you need, and that's where it can stop. And anything else can be entirely up to you. But there are also, they gave us some very technical stuff as well, like if you are working in an environment where you know that people might have disabilities, but you don't really know what they are, Do things like keeping the lighting down and don't talk too fast in meetings or talk over one another because someone might have difficulty following you. Don't use really strong smells or bring strong perfumes into work environments. Face people that you're talking to in case they can't hear you properly. And make sure that, this is the important thing, if there is a diversity policy at your work, that it's not all coordinated in its language towards people whose disabilities are visible. Because often places have things on their books about how important it is to accept people with different abilities into the work environment, which is fantastic. But sometimes they can word it in ways that don't include invisible ones. I mean, one of the big things was just ask. If someone has an invisible disability or seems to be struggling, ask how you can make your workplace more accessible to them, because they will probably know far better than you can. Assuming will not get as far as just going directly to them for their needs. And that is often the most powerful response. We are listening to you. Tell us how we can help.
Here at The Fairer Sense, we get real about money. So how real would it be if we then shoved a sponsor message on you trying to sell you something you don't need?
Not very.
So we won't do that.
But we will tell you about services we love that save you money on things you already use.
That's why we are super stoked that Season 2 of The Fairer Sense is sponsored by AutoSlash, the #1 site for getting a great deal on a car rental.
Because you gotta rent a car sometimes, right?
AutoSlash is completely free to use, and on average, renters save 30% or more using it.
AutoSlash searches all the major rental companies like Hertz, Avis, and Thrifty, so you won't end up in some sketchy no-name rental lot wondering what you've gotten yourself into. They do the legwork for you of seeking out the best discounts and coupon codes, so you save money and time.
And they don't stop looking for deals when you book. Up until the day you pick up the car, AutoSlash keeps searching for discounts and will email you if they find a lower rate. It's like price protection on your rental and one less thing you have to think about.
Why can't all travel be like that?
Right. Use AutoSlash to book your next rental car at autoslash.com. And I spoke to Kate from the blog Goodnight Debt about her personal struggle with invisible disability. Kate has the same disability that I have, EDS, although for her it manifests a little bit differently. And we talked a lot about her internal struggle of how much to talk about it at work and what the pros and cons of that are.
I have Ehlers-Danlos Syndrome. It is a connective tissue disorder where everything's kind of loosey-goosey. Nothing, basically all my joints are bad.
One of the things that really strikes me is that you talk about it as your disability and you use that word. You, I think, could totally pass for fully able-bodied. Talk us through kind of what was the process for you of getting to where you started using the D word.
I don't even know what else I would call it. Like, it is my limitation. It is something that holds me back. And I guess I don't know what else to call it. Is primarily, I think, why I use the D word. I think it's also something that I've slipped into a little bit over the last year or so. I've been open with coworkers of, yeah, this is why I wear tennis shoes at work. I probably shouldn't. It's probably not the best for my career, but I haven't found a shoe yet that doesn't destroy my feet because they change sizes depending on what day it is or what the weather's like and all of that. So being in something that's more comfortable and has the ability to expand or whatever, I'll be open with them of why I'm wearing that, and then I'll slip into shoes if I need to go to something more specific. We also have a disability group at work. The concept of I don't need the accommodations now, but I may in the future. I've slipped into, well, what can I do? Like, I don't need those services yet, or I don't need those accommodations yet, but somebody else may be needing those. So what do we need to do as a company to be able to accommodate effectively my future? I mean, it's selfish, but those people are there in that moment as well. So helping them not have limitations on just being able to do their job because they need to do it a little differently.
Mm-hmm. With talking about it at work, what was the first time you mentioned it at work? What was that like? Or what were some of the thoughts that led up to, because like that's a risk, even though it's illegal technically to discriminate against people with disabilities, we all know it still happens. We all know it's something where people might just see you a little differently. You already have a disadvantage being a woman of being less likely to be promoted, less likely to make it to senior management. And now you're like a quote unquote problem, potentially, by outing yourself as having some challenges. So do you have any lingering concerns about doing that?
It started because I didn't really have a choice about it. I subluxed my sternum, which according to my chiropractor can't happen, but then he had to put it back in place. And I couldn't walk properly. I had to be very rigid, very upright, couldn't make turns very easily, and I had to have ice on my chest, on the subluxation constantly to just be able to get it through the day.
I'm just going to add real quick here for folks who don't know. She's talking about subluxation, which is like a not quite dislocation.
Yes, and that is something new for me. I've always called it dislocating, but dislocating is it fully coming out, and I've never had a full dislocation. It's all been partial, which is a sublux. I actually learned that word like 2 years ago, so sometimes I call it dislocations because I'm just not used to the words. But in that situation, I had about a week and a half that I wasn't mobile, and it was during deadlines that I didn't have people that I could pass the work off to, so I just completed the work and how I needed to do it, but I couldn't function without this very rigid walking and going to the chiropractor and all that, so that kind of forced the conversation. And lately, since then, I've changed positions. My management now and my management then are friends, so I don't know if that ever crossed between them. Hopefully I wasn't labeled a problem child for disability reasons, maybe attitude. But it came up more recently. One of my coworkers is older and needs a hip replacement, so he's been talking about that, and it just kind of came out. And then the shoe thing, my boss likes to wear impractical shoes, and she's been getting rid of them because she keeps falling. And I just brought up why I wear tennis shoes most of the time and probably had an overshare, but everything's been fine. And I thought it felt safe at the time since I didn't need the accommodation. I wasn't asking for anything. It was just sharing a bit about me instead of, yes, I have this issue and I need a standing desk and it's going to be however much it is, or I need to whatever that's going to cost money or require them to change how they feel they need to treat me. So opening the conversation before I needed to felt safer.
Do you ever feel like you have to work harder, or do you feel like there's more pressure on you because folks know?
Yes and no. My current position is everyone's in the storm together. Everyone needs to pull their weight. And I had some very high pain days recently. It was so painful I couldn't think. Like the only thing was these pain pills need to kick in soon. Otherwise I need to go home because I can't get anything done. And I really had, I don't know, I almost felt like I needed to look busy or act busy or try and put on this facade that I wasn't in debilitating pain trying to sit at my desk. Thankfully, the pain pills kicked in, so I only lost maybe an hour that happened to nicely fit over lunch, so it didn't really impact the day or the day's work. But yeah, if more pain days come up like that, I think it might be a bad decision to have shared things.
Thinking about like your experience as a woman in the healthcare system with a rare disease, what that's been like.
It's been fun. Primarily, I think the reaction has been both by professionals and we'll say quasi-professionals. Like I was a swimmer, swim coaches and all of that. The reaction is you're a liar or that's not possible. And part of that is that some of the things that happen with EDS is they're very hard to describe. And until 2 years ago, I mean, granted, I've been having subluxations my entire life. I didn't call it the right word because I didn't know that was a thing. Like my joint is not where it's supposed to be for nearly everybody else, that means it's dislocated. So I called it that. And I don't know, maybe that's something that as a whole with this disease or disability, it might limit everything and therefore impacting women because EDS impacts more women than men. I was a very sick kid. So I was at the doctor constantly, and they did call me a liar a lot. Like, one of the things with EDS is you can't always regulate your body temperature. I was told to just put on a sweater. And it's like, no, it's more than that. Like, I don't really create body heat, and it's impacting a lot of things. It just seemed very casual, dismissive, and I don't know, I mean, it can be debilitating and incredibly painful. So I guess I have experienced it in that sense, but more in small doses that stick with you. So lots of liars. I'm a big fat liar.
One of the effects of EDS is actually it affects your immune system. And most of us who have it have that experience of having been sick kids. I remember when I was 8 years old, I almost died of osteomyelitis, which means like a infection on a bone. In my case, it was on my ischium, the bottom, the kind of like round curvy parts of your pelvis. And I remember being in the doctor, like writhing in pain. I had high fever. And the doctor told my parents with me in the room that I was faking the pain and that it was just strep and I was just seeking attention. And I know in my case, like that stuff, I do think affected my worldview and kind of how I relate to the world of seeing like people don't believe me when I speak and when I describe my experience. People call me a liar. I don't know that I ever connected it as a gender question. And who knows? I mean, maybe she would have said the exact same thing if a boy was there. So like, let's not necessarily assume it was gender, even though there's plenty of data to support that it probably was. But I think for me, like that was part of me learning early in life that I would have to fight harder to make my voice heard, or that I think I was too stubborn to ever think my voice is less valid, but I definitely internalized the idea that lots of people think my voice is less valid. And I'm curious if you feel like kind of those interactions, being called a liar, like any of that, if you can sort of like consciously connect the dots for anything in your adult life.
I'm a naturally stubborn person, or maybe this made me stubborn. I don't know which is the chicken or the egg. I think it's made me more strategic from being called a liar a lot, especially at the doctor.
What do you wish people knew about invisible disabilities?
I think a lot of people think that there's some sort of glamour in getting the attention of being sick. And a lot of people with invisible disabilities is that everyone's just trying to get by. Everyone's just trying to go to Target or get their groceries or go to work and do the best job that they can.
One of the things that really jumped out at me is this idea of having to constantly expose yourself and your invisible disability to someone just in order to function. Having to say to your employer, hey, I have X syndrome and I need to go to the doctor for infusions every 8 weeks. I have a friend who has an invisible disability, or I guess it's a chronic illness, but it's also kind of an invisible disability. Once again, the gray area.
This is that hard, blurry line. Yeah.
And they need to get infusions every 8 weeks. It usually falls on a weekday in the morning, and they need to explain that when they go in for job interviews and say, this is a part of my life. And I just can't imagine having to do that. I cannot imagine having to do that. Or something else that struck me is how many jobs you simply would not be able to do because of your invisible disability. I have worked for a long time in the food service industry, which is long hours on your feet and moving heavy objects. And like you, Tanja, could not do that job full time simply because of your body and how it's built, let alone that it's pretty unglamorous work.
That's why I wouldn't do it, is because I only do glamorous work.
No shade to any people in the food service industry at all. I'm just real burnt out. But that would be in some ways so limiting. And so those two together, having to constantly justify your own health needs and saying, I can't be X, Y, and Z things because of my health needs, that's a totally different world than the world I'm living in.
I mean, it's totally true. And I think it's like you always say, there are layers to this. When I was working, I did not disclose to most of the people that I work with my EDS. I did talk about other things. People knew that I got migraines because I kind of couldn't hide that. I would have to take time off of work for them. That was something that was pretty widely known by everyone I was close with at work. I also had to disclose the fact that I, for medical reasons, not trendy diet reasons, can't eat gluten in any form and can't eat anything that touched it. And it's a huge pain in the butt, but that's something I'm used to. So that was something that people who traveled with me certainly knew and that I had to talk about. I kind of made peace with people knowing those aspects of my medical business, but I didn't really feel like disclosing more than that. And then when I told my company that I was leaving, I did share that of like, this is part of my motivation is I have a degenerative disease that's going to get worse. And I can't risk that all of my able-bodied years are spent working. And that by the time I get to retirement age, I'm, in a wheelchair or just not able to do the things that I dream of doing. But everybody has to make that choice differently. We heard Kate say that she feels like she needs the people working around her to know about her EDS so that she can wear different shoes and sit in weird positions sometimes if she's having a rib dislocate. And, I think it's really rough when you feel like that choice is made for you. I mean, that's, I think, ultimately what it comes down to is we all want to be in control of what we share and to whom and what we keep private. And sometimes having an invisible disability kind of forces your hand.
Absolutely. I think, too, about the way it affects our money, because there are stigmas that come along with being disabled or being chronically ill. People think you can't work as hard, you're not going to do as good a job, you're weak. And that might manifest in bias against you in a hiring process. That might manifest against you in pay scaling upwards. People might not want to give you promotions if they think, oh, well, you're going to be out with a migraine. I'll give it to Susie instead. And I think that people often forget or don't consider that this is going to impact your money in that way. I think something else that, as I spoke with Dr. Thorpe about, is the invisibility of mental illnesses and people who are living with depression, people who are living with schizophrenia, or insert any mental illness here. There is such huge stigma surrounding that, which we talked about in our mental health episode a little bit. But again, I can't imagine having to disclose to the person who signs my paycheck, I have insert anything here. I would be so concerned. I deal with financial anxiety anyway. I would be so concerned about how that affects my paycheck.
That is completely real. It does feel like mental illness is still kind of at the bottom of that hierarchy. And I know in my own life, I will say there were years when I was working when I went to therapy every single week, and it had to be during work hours. There was no way around that. But I didn't ever tell anyone I was going to therapy. I told them I was going to physical therapy, and I didn't say why. So it wasn't like this is related to my invisible disability thing, although I am a huge fan of physical therapy. Just for everyone who's ever gotten a prescription for it and hasn't done it, go do it. It is great. But it felt better to say I have a physical health weakness than to say I have a mental illness issue I need to deal with, even though they are both equally as important.
I know somebody who goes to therapy once a week, and on their work calendar, it says doctor. And they've just never explained it to the company beyond, I have a doctor's appointment once a week.
And I mean, there are probably those who are guessing who figured it out. But yeah, no, I mean, I think you're right. There is stigma to a lot of this. And I think therapy and mental illness are one thing. I think another thing is any invisible disability that involves chronic fatigue feels especially stigmatized in the workplace. The same way that mothers are penalized for taking sick days to care for their children more than fathers, and that their absences from work are penalized against them more than similar absences for fathers. I think it's the same with women in particular who have chronic fatigue and might need to be late to work or miss some work or work from home. All of that gets perceived as laziness or lack of commitment to the job, unless perhaps you do out yourself and you have a sympathetic supervisor. But I think there's still this idea that so many of these health conditions that cause chronic fatigue are in people's heads. Like I keep hearing about the chronic Lyme disease debate and whether chronic Lyme is a thing or if it's not, but it triggers something else like chronic fatigue syndrome. It all has this air of essentially the patients are faking or they're imagining it when like bull fucking shit. Just because medical science hasn't figured out the answer yet, or just because medical science denies women's pain and health struggles, it doesn't mean it's not real. But when that's the world we live in, that translates into perceptions of it at work. And this idea that we are lazy or not committed enough just because we need to be able to rest a little bit more. I'm sorry that I'm swearing so much when you were trying to keep it family friendly.
Totally fine. Something that just occurs to me is, we hear about the term compassion fatigue, particularly around the gun debate here in the United States. People stop responding to horrific events because we see them so frequently. And of course, that happens probably, I'm not a scientist, but I feel like it's probably happening within a professional environment. Bosses, coworkers probably experience compassion fatigue if Jenny is always needing, in their minds, special accommodation, or, well, why does Jenny get to wear sneakers? Why does Kate get to wear the sneakers? If they choose not to disclose, or even if they do choose to disclose, having to always be the exception, they get annoyed. But if you take 4 seconds and think about it, you're like, yo, that person is living with a chronic illness or an invisible disability, and that sucks way more than me having to not wear sneakers in the workplace. I think about that. It's hard to always have compassion, but I think it's so important that we do. And I think that's how we change things like sick leave policy and paid time off and create more flexible work space and work hours to include more workers. I know so many people across the United States want to go back to work, but they may not be physically able to, or workplace policies don't allow them to. So really, we are cutting off a portion of the population who may be able to work under different circumstances when we have too rigid a workplace policy and when we think too rigidly about what constitutes health.
We could have a whole separate episode about how messed up the rules are with, for example, Social Security disability payments or disability insurance payments that you might get if you have a job and you have to stop working, because they're essentially all or nothing. If you do any kind of part-time work, then you lose all of that income permanently, which just creates a whole bad list of negative incentives for people. But I think that aside, yes, compassion, 100%. We all need more compassion. We all need more empathy, more kindness. But honestly, I feel like a huge part of this is just like people minding their own business, because an experience that I had multiple times growing up, my dad is also disabled. His disability is a bit more visible than mine. His posture is visibly twisted, and anyone who paid attention for half a second would see that he has some physical challenges. But that said, he's not in a wheelchair. He can get up and walk around. He got chased multiple times that I witnessed by people who felt the need to go intercept him and tell him what a horrible human being he was for parking in a handicapped spot. And I've heard similar stories from people with EDS with much worse cases than mine, people who in some cases are in wheelchair part-time and in other cases aren't, but feel the need to be able to have access to a handicapped spot, which I respect that decision on their part, and that people will leave them nasty notes and say, like, how dare you, a healthy young person, park in this spot? It should be reserved for sick old people. There's sort of a weird level of ageism in all this. And it just comes down to the same idea. It's the same as like white people calling the cops on Black people who have the audacity to exist in society. It's like, mind your own business. Like the fact that someone might need an accommodation sometimes and might be fine other times. Yes, I get that's confusing for you. That makes you uncomfortable, but that's not the disabled person's responsibility to manage. That's your responsibility. And we just need to get back to that mindset of let people do their thing. Don't worry yourself with it. Let them go about their life and know that everyone's got their own struggles one way or another.
Hell yeah.
You can tell I don't feel at all strongly about this topic.
I think we should feel strongly about it because I do think we live in a world that is set up to favor certain people, and therefore we are leaving other people behind, which is on its face not okay. It's not okay. And especially when there is a solution, and the solution here being A, mind your own business. B, understand that not everyone is having your experience. And C, work to build systems that include multiple experiences. I mean, it's a 3-step process, folks. It's not hard.
I completely agree with all that, shockingly. I think I would add too, it's sort of the subtle dimension of it is what I would call kind of the low-level shaming. And we've talked about this in different dimensions before, whether it's about beauty standards or it's about kind of what your life looks like and how together you are financially and what people project online. This is something we've talked about before, the idea that everyone has the same 24 hours in the day as Beyonce or as fill in the blank of productive superstar person here. Kara, you and I have the same amount of time as Oprah, but we're not Oprah. Sentiments like that, while well-intended, attempting to inspire everyone to just work a little harder or hustle a little harder, are fundamentally untrue. First of all, if you have household help and you're not wasting time doing laundry and dishes like Beyonce, then you do actually have more time than someone who has to do those things themselves, which is most of us. But I think for those who have additional health challenges, a good metaphor is the spoon theory, which we looked this up. The spoon theory was an idea coined by Christine. I'm totally going to mess up her last name, but Miserandino? I don't know. Sorry, Christine, for butchering your name. But she wrote an essay in 2003 called The Spoon Theory. And the idea is that you only get so many spoons in the day if you're a person who has an invisible disability or a chronic health condition, and that you have to parcel them out in thoughtful, deliberate ways, and that things that don't exhaust, quote unquote, normal people might exhaust you. And that if you push it one day, you are borrowing against future spoons. So essentially it's the idea you can't get a free lunch. You can't just like go through your life as though you have endless energy if you have a different health condition. And I think it's a good analogy in the sense of like, we don't all have the same amount of energy in the day. We don't all have the same ability to get things done. And so that's kind of a separate rant, but it ties into that idea of the messages that we send and the expectations we put on people. And to add to all of what you said, Kara, just understanding that people are going to be able to contribute at different levels and at different amounts and are going to be productive in different ways. And we have to allow for that because that is just simply the reality of human experience. And if we expect everyone to produce exactly as much work as a super productive, completely healthy, young 20-something worker, we're all going to be disappointed all the time. We're going to be shaming people who are actually really trying their best. And that is no way to be.
I agree. One of my favorite podcasts, Call Your Girlfriend, there are 2 hosts, Anne and Amina. And Amina has been very open about how she has depression. And she and Anne were talking about how they were working together. They were just sitting co-working together, and Amina was having a really hard time getting anything done. And she looked over and said, Anne, you're so productive. You're so much better than me. And Anne just looked up and said, I don't have depression, which I thought was honestly the most compassionate thing she possibly could have said in that situation, because Amina was feeling stressed. She wasn't getting work done, but Amina has an additional hurdle to get over than Anne does. Anne sits down and can bust out some words and does not have to deal with depression. And Amina does. That does not prevent her from being productive at all. Amina is an incredible human that I am a big fan of and has been way more productive than I have, for example. But it's like when we talk about privilege, it's not to say if you're white, for example, that you haven't experienced hardships in your life. It's just that none of those hardships have been on the basis of your race. And it's not to say that non-disabled people don't have scheduling challenges and don't also have productivity challenges. It's just to say you're not dealing with this disability. And that's okay. It's okay to say that. I feel like we're living in this time where you can't say, I have a different experience than you without getting fucking jumped on. But I really feel like if we can all just take a step back and say, you're doing A, I'm doing B, them over there, they're doing C, she's doing F, and that person way over there in the corner is doing 9. And that's okay. How can we all exist together? How can we all live in a world that is fair to all of us?
Oh my gosh, I love that. I love that Anne said that to Amina. Gosh, I mean, that's just like being the best friend in the world is recognizing someone's circumstances and not using that as a blunt instrument to tell someone they can't do something, but just using it as a way to show compassion, I think is amazing. Whew. Okay, I clearly had some things to say today. Thank you for listening.
I loved it. This has been such a good episode.
this stuff is so tied into people's careers and ability to work and ability to earn money. And I honestly think this is a topic we're going to come back to. I feel like I am just becoming aware of some of the things in society that disabled people face. And these are not small numbers. We're talking about 1 billion people worldwide with disabilities, according to the World Health Organization. And according to data from the US, it's like 74% of them who don't have any visible sign of disability, like no wheelchair or like cane if you're blind, to signal to the world around you that you have a disability. And as I've seen with my dad, like if people don't see the wheelchair, some people are going to make assumptions about you faking or not really having different needs. And there's some stuff I've been aware of for a long time, but other stuff that I'm just learning about. And I think that this is something we'll for sure want to talk about again.
Yeah, I'm just remembering one time I saw on Tumblr, it was 2 pictures, one of a page of a book that looks totally normal and one of a page of a book as how it appears to someone who has dyslexia. And it was pure gibberish. And I love reading. And I'm trying to think, of course you would hate reading and you would hate school if you saw gibberish and then people told you were stupid because they weren't seeing gibberish and you can't explain it to them. And it's like a whole crazy thing. And moral of the story, there's so much more to unpack here because it really does affect so many people at so many stages of life, at so many stages of money. And I feel like now I'm getting really passionate. We're trying to wrap it up and I'm like, we got to get into it.
Yeah, we didn't even get into the things that fall into the learning disabilities category, where we mostly talked about stuff where people might think you're faking or you're lazy, but we didn't talk about the ones where people would say, oh, you're stupid, when you're not. You just have a challenge reading, but that doesn't mean you can't comprehend things or can't imagine ideas. So, oh gosh, yes. Yeah, we have way more to say on this. We definitely want more perspectives. And so please share yours with us. If you have an invisible disability or you know someone who does, we'd love to hear how that affects you. We are certainly going to be doing wrap-up episode at the end of the season, and we'll talk about some of the notes that we've gotten. We've gotten some amazing ones so far this season. So please share your thoughts with us on invisible disabilities. You can always get us at fairersense@gmail.com or on Twitter @fairersense.
And if you're loving the show, you can always rate and review us on iTunes. We love reading your comments. So whether you email us, tweet at us, or leave us a review on iTunes, we love hearing from you.
It means so much to us. And it's also a big part of the Apple algorithm that helps the show climb up in the charts. The more star reviews we have, the more people can find the show and the more we can break down the patriarchy.
Yeah. I just envisioned us with like capes. That pause was me envisioning us standing on rooftops, our capes flapping in the breeze. And we're like, another day, another patriarchy smashed.
Coming season 3 of The Fairer Sense.
Capes. Oh my God. And masks. I'm not going to lie. I love a good mask.
I'm not a huge mask fan, but you could probably convince me. I don't feel strongly. Until we get capes and masks, stay rad, Kara.
Stay rad, Tanya.
The Fairer Sense are me, Tanja Hester, and the world's best co-host, Kara Perez. Our theme song is by The Insider, our ad music is by Kevin MacLeod, and you can find out more info about the other artists you hear on the show at our website, thefairersense.com. You can always find me at ournextlife.com and Kara at bravelygo.co.
I said go ahead.
I think you had it.
Oh my God. Okay. All right. BRB.